is the Atari 8-bit podcast.
I sat there playing these games, and the idea of I could do this, or I could build one of these, welled up in my head. All of the pleasure of this project was in developing the game. I got very little pleasure out of the business aspect of it.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Peter Liepa was co-creator and programmer of Boulder Dash and Boulder Dash 2 for the Atari computers. Boulder Dash was published by First Star Software in 1984 and is regarded as a seminal game for the Atari 8-bit machines. This interview took place on June 16, 2015. Tell me about the first time you saw an Atari computer.
I had a friend who was into these things. I think he had an Atari 2600. He had, a gigantic TV screen in a tiny apartment. Mm-hmm. And he bought an Atari 400 when they came out. And I don't know, once a week or so, a bunch of us would go over and play video games. And so that was my first exposure to an Atari 400.
So at some point you decided to get one for yourself?
Yeah, after playing these games, the idea, I was a software developer at the time, but kind of doing more conventional business-oriented stuff.
For what kind of platform?
I think at the time it was something called an IBM Series 1, which was a mini computer built for real-time control. I'd studied control theory at university and got my first job working on that, but that very quickly evolved into, again, more data processing type stuff. Mm-hmm. Anyways, I sat there playing these games, and the idea of I could do this, or I could build one of these, welled up in my head. So I went out and bought my own Atari 800.
So what kind of games had you hooked? What were you playing at your friend's place? Do you remember?
Good question. At my friend's place, it was things like Miner 49er, I think Mule. Mm-hmm. The games that I bought for myself and really got hooked on were Crossfire, Choplifter, maybe Oil's Well. Mm-hmm. I remember playing that. That is kind of all I can think of offhand.
So at some point you must have said to yourself, I can do this, I'm going to learn machine language. Tell me about that process.
Well, again, I thought I can do this myself even before I bought the computer. That's the reason I bought the computer. I had already had some exposure to machine language or very low-level language. The IBM Series 1, for example, ran on something like that, more an interpreted low-level language, something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I'm sure I had machine language exposure, although I can't remember explicitly how or why, so maybe I didn't. But my journey, I think, started, in those days everybody read Byte magazine, and that's where you got all your information, along with the manuals that came with the Atari. And I read about this language called Forth, which was really suitable for programming on environments with really low memory. I think these machines came with maybe 8K. So I set about, I think, acquiring a Forth interpreter / compiler. I guess it's an interpreter, and learning that. I'm sure I also did lots of stuff like everybody else, typing in demos from Byte magazine and the various other magazines that were there. That would, of course, have been in BASIC.
But Boulder Dash was not programmed in Forth, was it?
It was. Well, it was originally. If we want to jump way ahead here, Boulder Dash was developed in Forth. around the time where it became apparent that it was, a shippable product, or how do we say it? I was beginning to shop for publishers.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I can't remember whether this was before I contacted anybody or after, but yes, I realized that I would have to convert this to machine language, if anything, only to embed it on a cartridge. And I think there was a kind of half-baked assembler available, developed in Forth. It wasn't complete, so I think I ended up completing it, and I gradually ported, sort of in place, or migrated Boulder Dash from Forth to assembler.
Wow.
I believe I could, sort of partially convert a bit at a time, although, again, I don't quite remember how that worked.
Mm-hmm. It seems like a project.
Well, it was a project, write your own assembler, or at least finish your own assembler, and port the thing over. I don't think I rewrote it from scratch.
Okay, so let's jump back. So you're there, you're learning Forth, you're thinking about programming a game, and tell me the story of how the beginnings of Boulder Dash started to happen.
My situation was that I had plenty of ideas for games, but no idea whatsoever of the market or how to get them published. And I found out about a local publisher. I lived in Toronto, so local means one of the, suburbs around Toronto, called In-Home Software. They had published at least one game, if not more. Mm-hmm. So I went and talked to them with the question, I am an aspiring game developer, what genre would you suggest I adopt? And their response was that they knew this young man who had submitted a game in BASIC called Pitfall that was not really commercial quality, but they thought it had potential. Mm-hmm. And his name was Chris Grace, so we got together. And the project started off with the intent simply of converting his program to machine language and letting In-Home publish it. When I actually got home with the game, I realized it was kind of primitive, which I suppose, it was in BASIC. It was a single screen. It reminded me of a game called The Pit, which was an arcade game at the time. Mm-hmm. It had rocks and dirt. But after playing it for a few hours, I just thought, this needs more spice. This needs different dynamics. And so I kind of put it aside and just went and started writing. And I don't know whether I think it was in Forth, but I don't know for sure. I just started writing some prototype physics for rocks and dirt. Technically, it was a cellular automaton, so the physics were fake physics, obviously, or grid-based, discrete-based. But the idea was that I would simply put rocks and dirt on a screen using a random number generator. I may have added some way of painting them on as well, and then I would just play, and the physics would be that rocks would be supported by other rocks and dirt, but once you took away the dirt, the rocks would fall, and if a rock fell on another rock and there was a chance to fall sideways, it would do so. And after a couple of days, I think I had that running, and I found myself quite fascinated. I just loved playing with it, and so that kind of in a nutshell was where Boulder Dash was born.
So you collaborated with Chris over long distance somehow?
Well, so that was a little problematic because, it was long distance, and I think we found out pretty quickly that we were on fairly different wavelengths. So unfortunately, that collaboration kind of fizzled, and I more or less took off on my own with the game.
So you worked on it for about 6 months, is what I read?
Yes.
You had a real job at this time too, right?
I did not. I think one of the decisions I'd made was to quit any real job I had. Mm-hmm. At the time, I think I was kind of working as a contractor / consultant. And the idea may have been originally to kind of blend the two, but I decided, yes, I was just going to live on savings and work on this game. Some friends of mine who were also working as consultants had an office, and they kindly rented me a desk, so I'd actually have a workplace. And so yeah, it was full time in the sense of I wasn't doing anything else. It was part time in that probably my productive hours were 2 or 3 hours a day. The rest of the day was just sitting around, preparing to work or coming up with inspiration or whatever.
Right. So I find it odd that you originally went to In-Home, but you ended up publishing with First Star. Was In-Home circling the drain by the time you were done with the game?
I do not know. All I know is that several months into the project, when I thought I had something that could see the light of day in terms of being published, I started urging them to, put together a contract for me, a publishing agreement. Mm-hmm. And at that point, even though I'd had, talks with them occasionally, I guess, to show progress, nothing was happening. And I don't know why, but I don't know that they were circling the drain or had other things to do. They were just not responding. So at some point I just, cut my losses there and started searching for publishers in the States.
So how did you do that search, and how did you find First Star?
Well, again, everything. Now I use Byte magazine probably as a stand-in for all of the publications of the day, but in those days there were, I suppose, a number of publishers. Electronic Arts was really just in its infancy. Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, Parker Brothers, I think, was in the business. Mm-hmm. I kind of decided, for better or for worse, that rather than go with a West Coast company, I would go with an East Coast company. And First Star was based in New York. They were somehow affiliated with Warner Brothers or Warner Communications. And, in those days, I suppose you could work long distance, but it wasn't the way you do it now, where you just pick up Skype or, transfer files. Those are still in the days of snail mail, and I don't think email really existed. So I simply went with a company that was geographically close and looked like it was viable. And of course, they were very happy to take the game.
Sure, I bet. Was it 90% done at that point? Was it absolutely complete?
I'd say 90% done. Yeah. There may have been 8 screens out of 16, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm not quite sure. I do know that the negotiations took quite a while, several weeks, and by that time I actually had started working again. So the game was essentially complete in terms of all its mechanics and all that. It may actually have had 16 caves. I think about the only change they asked for was to add some, quote, intermissions, because that was the thing in those days. Mm-hmm. And so I just ended up building some mini caves with slightly different rules. So yeah, it's funny. All I can say is I think a more business-oriented person or a more fame-oriented person would have been increasingly excited by this thing being published and money coming in, but for me, all the joy was really in developing the game.
Okay, so what was technically interesting? What was technically joyful about it? That what'd you about actually developing it? What was interesting about it for you?
Well, my background is in mathematics. My vocation was in software development. As a child and young adult, I'd been very interested in things like art and music, animation. And for me, this was a way where they all came together in a really compelling way. So it was kind of deeply satisfying because I think everybody has poles in their natures. Everybody has a kind of, split between left brain and right, and this interest and that interest, and the demands of vocation versus things that they dream about doing. And until you can actually bring those things together, you don't realize how satisfying it can be. So it was a really fulfilling experience.
Awesome. I think it's interesting that Boulder Dash is it's still it's still owned by First Star, amazingly, and it's still a property that they develop. It's really been had an enduring legacy.
Yes, it is kind of interesting. It's I think I've often thought, well, geez, I could have gone with Electronic Arts maybe, and maybe they were a much bigger, more successful publisher. But I think with First Star, this kind of longevity. It was basically one of their few properties, and it seemed to be the one that had real legs. I suspect with Electronic Arts, we would never have heard of Boulder Dash again.
Right.
Not that I've got anything against Electronic Arts, and this is all speculative.
Sure. Do you still get a slice of Boulder Dash from them?
Yes, I do, which always amazes me. The large part of the royalties, of course, were within the first few years of the game coming out. And then I think there was a long dry spell where it was just felt that 2D arcade games like that were old-fashioned. There was no market for them. And then I guess with things like the internet and new kinds of computers, especially mobile, coming out, there was sort of a resurgence of interest, if you will. So yes, there are still royalty checks coming to this day.
So you finished Boulder Dash, and then what happened? Was Boulder Dash 2 a foregone conclusion, or what happened then?
I think First Star indicated an interest in Boulder Dash 2. And so I created that. It was very much based on Boulder Dash 1. So I think I had some new entities in the game, and I simply developed another 16 caves and new theme music, that sort of thing. But yes, I guess it was simply the second game or the second installment in the series.
Right. Now, you were the Atari programmer. Did you have any involvement in porting Boulder Dash to all the other platforms that it was ported to?
No. First Star went and found other people to port. The one porting job I did was to the PC Junior, which was supposed to be the next big thing.
Oh, you poor thing.
Yeah. So yes, I had the pleasure of implementing Boulder Dash on the PC Junior, and I guess we were interested in having it run on the PC as well. Unfortunately, neither of those boxes were very good as game machines. I did as good a job as I could, and got deeper into chip architecture than I would ever want to on that kind of machine. To make things like scrolling work in real time. But yeah, I think that kind of sunk without a trace. So
yeah.
big waste of time.
I read in a couple places that you left the world of games due to a lack of enthusiasm for the other platforms which had followed the Atari computers, which this is a highly relevant question for me because this is an Atari podcast. So tell me why the Atari was better than everything else.
Wow, that is kind of a hard question. I'm not sure that I've got the ammunition to answer it off the top of my head.
Okay.
It just seemed purpose-built for games. It was a really nice design, and I think there's just so much available. Everything fell into place. I kind of started looking at Commodore 64s, and I'm not even sure how I did that because I don't think I ever owned one, but I just thought the architecture there was so kludgy, and you were kind of funny against it. Maybe they had just made a much cheaper, or designed a machine that was much cheaper to build than Atari. I don't know. My dislike was not entirely realistic, I suppose, because as a game machine and as a computer, the Commodore 64 probably was way more successful in a commercial way than Atari, and there were no shortage of games, and in fact a lot of people just thought Boulder Dash was a Commodore 64 game. And it turned out to port very well to the Commodore 64. But yeah, I just wasn't attracted to it the way I was to the Atari. And by the time you got to PCs, the graphics were business oriented, if anything. Sure. And you could just do so much less. It really was a dream machine, I thought.
So after Boulder Dash 2, I guess you didn't have too much involvement in the other things that came after. Is that right?
Right. First Star, I think, realized, with the royalty structure, or perhaps for other reasons, that if they started developing these on their own, they'd, I guess, have more control and more revenue. Although, I'm speculating here, but it made sense. I think they did draw me in as a consultant on a few of the sequels. There was a construction kit that I think was in the weeds, and I can never quite remember, but there was some arcade version that they were doing where, again, the project was a bit in the weeds, and they needed somebody to develop or design levels for them. But both of those were kind of short-lived and somewhat incidental. Yeah.
So after that, you went back to a real job, and that more or less the end of the Atari story from your perspective?
Yeah, that was the end of the Atari story for me. Probably just as well. I mean, I had thought about doing something completely different on the Atari, but I don't know. The ideas didn't gel, and I think by that time there were just commercial things happening in the industry. The industry crashed. Yeah. It seemed to crash every couple of years. And yeah, other interests took over. I mean, I had a really strong desire to get into high-end graphics at the time, so there were just other things to do.
Do you have anything to do with the iPhone version?
Oh, you mean the new one?
Yes.
I was asked to develop a cave pack, and I did that back last year. I believe that cave pack is still waiting to be released as part of an update. That's all I can say. I did a cave pack. It's not out yet.
So how was it getting back into creating levels again?
It was actually very enjoyable. Everything was already there in terms of the new game physics and a cave builder. So all I had to do was come up with, I think, 20 caves, which, mind you, took about a month. The creative process here is actually quite difficult, I find. You start with a blank page. Actually, what I did was I would just throw elements at random, on the screen and sort of tinker with them and see what kind of new behaviors there were in this version. And, then I would just sort of play until I came up, I guess, with certain puzzles. So there was a theme to every cave. sometimes I would just have to go out for long bicycle rides, and clear my mind and come up with ideas, stop the bike, write them down, or at least tap them into my phone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably to actually build any cave, once you got the idea, it was only 2 or 3 hours, but you could spend twice that time trying to come up with ideas or just playing around.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, a very, very enjoyable process. I really liked it, and I hope someday that cave pack will actually be released, and people will get to try it out.
Awesome. What haven't I asked you yet that I should have?
Well, we did kind of fast forward very much from the start of the game development to publishing and aftermath. When you develop a game, I guess from start to finish, you start off with very rough stuff, and these original boulder and dirt physics were really just circles and squares on a screen. Eventually you have to flesh that in with graphics. The graphics were originally in the 24 by 40 format. I did show that to In-Home at one point, and they said, well, the little guy is just not really that interesting. He's got to be more recognizable. He's got to be bigger. And so I put a lot of work into doubling the size of the characters, which is where the scrolling came from.
Mm-hmm.
And to flesh all that out, it was not only a matter of writing the game or writing the software for the game, but doing the music, doing the sound effects, doing the graphics and animation. Anyways, all of that pretty well from scratch. And it was all a great pleasure to do.
Did you compose the theme song yourself?
Yes, I did. And I wrote a music editor to do it. I actually didn't see the score until a couple of years ago when, I pulled out the old listings,
Mm-hmm.
The old machine code listings of the notes. It was a 4-voice composition, and typed that into an online scoring program. And I have yet to actually play it on a piano. And I had to get a musical friend to tell me what key the whole thing was in. But yeah, in those days it was just, I wrote my own music editor, 4-voice music editor, and basically plunked notes on a screen and worked out this composition.
If you could send a message to the Atari computer community that still exists, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
The first thing that comes to mind is the "Get a life" quip from Bill Shatner, but right. That's kind of cruel or insensitive. I don't know, Kevin. I tend not to live in the past very much.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's kind of amazing what people do. I know that a few years ago somebody developed an Atari 2600 version of Boulder Dash, which is, I think, truly an amazing thing. Simply because that machine was so difficult to program on. It's kind of, legendary how difficult it was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I say more power to you. It's actually the Boulder Dash community, I think, that I'm most impressed by. They're kind of really keeping that alive.
Yeah, you mentioned the 2600 version. A friend of mine named Bill did there's an annual 10-line basic programming contest for the Atari, and Bill Kendrick did a 10-line basic version of Boulder Dash, just like get as close to the gameplay as possible in 10 lines of basic code. It's pretty fun.
Okay, that is actually very cool. It's probably not that surprising because at the core of it, Boulder Dash is extremely simple. I actually participated in a JavaScript programming contest, a little like that, where you had 1,024 characters or less to write a game or to do a demo in. And yes, I basically wrote a game. And yes, that can be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think the winner of that contest actually wrote a chess game in less than 1,024 characters.
Yikes.
And that totally blows away anything I did.
Right, yeah. I've had that experience too. Someone wrote a version of Pole Position in 10 lines of BASIC like that. It's not even possible.
Wow.
Yeah. This was great. Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, it was my pleasure, Kevin. And I will say hello to all those fans of the podcast. It's great work that I think you guys are doing. It's strange to be, I'm ancient history, right? You're a historian, and this stuff all has to be captured before it all goes.
Well, thank you very much.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.